My guest at this time is Dr. Tim Ball. He's a former professor of climatology at the University of Winnipeg. He is the author of numerous articles and books, most prominently The Deliberate Corruption of Climate Science. We want to get his thoughts today on how the Democratic presidential hopefuls are looking at the environment following their appearances on a CNN town hall related to climate change earlier in the week. And Dr. Ball, thanks very much for being with us.
Well, thanks for the opportunity.
Well, I know we usually talk more about climate science than energy policy, but the reaction to what folks think is happening in terms of climate policy is determining what they want to do with energy policy. But everyone in the Democratic field is essentially going off this estimate, which has now become largely an assumption from the UN last year, as of 2018, that we had 12 years before the tipping point and we can never recover the climate that we need to perpetuate ourselves as a species. So now we're down to 11 years. Refresh our memories. What does the UN base that on?
Well, they base it on research that was put together under Agenda 21, which was actually a plan for the whole world for the 21st century. And it included the political side of it, which was, of course, essentially socialism. But the argument that they made for the requirement for a world government was that the science that they created, the science side of it was the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which was set up in Geneva. And they came out with a report that said that they were 95% certain that human CO2 was causing climate change, which is simply, it's absolute scientific rubbish. And that became then the basis of the policy to reduce CO2, which of course is effectively to reduce industry. And so this was the basis of the report, but the whole thing was deliberately orchestrated. And in 1992, it was all set out in the Rio Declaration, and Maurice Strong chaired that. He was the architect of the policy and the establishment of it. And, of course, since then, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has produced these almost annual reports on how bad the global warming is getting. They just came out with one a couple of days or 2 or 3 days ago with more of the extreme alarmism. But what people need to know, and this is absolutely critical to this, is that when any commission of inquiry is set up, it is given terms of reference for what it is required to research. Now, most people, including those that think they know about the science, believe that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is looking at total climate change, when in fact the definition they were given was only to look at human causes of climate change. And of course that, since humans have no effect on the sun, they ignore the sun. And they say, yes, we produce water vapor, but the amount we produce is so small relative to the total amount, so they ignore that. And that way then they can focus on CO2. In fact, what's going on right now is the sun is in a solar minimum, and we're seeing cooling. In the last 3 years, the global temperature, and you don't see this in the mainstream media, the global temperature has dropped 0.41 degrees in the last 3 years. Now, that doesn't sound like very much, but when you consider that the whole global alarmism on climate is based upon the fact that the temperature went up 0.6 degrees in 120 years, and yet it's dropped 0.4 in just 3 years, and it doesn't get reported. So this is where we are, and as I said, the whole thing is designed to shut down industry and to limit development, and the claim is that the only way we can do that is to have one world government, that no one nation can deal with it. So you need a world government to deal with it, and that's the whole objective.
I promise we are going to get to the candidates, but you mentioned something that I think is worthy of pursuing here for just a moment. And you mentioned how the global temperature has dropped more than 0.4 of a degree in just the last 3 years. Yet we regularly see headlines, I think it happened again in this past July, for example, of the hottest month on record. everything's hotter than it's ever been. So how do we put the two together? Where are they getting those numbers from, and how do we reconcile that with what you just told us?
Well, of course, first of all, one of the things that's happening is the jet stream is moving well north and well south. So you've got warm air pushing well north and cold air pushing well south. That's creating the warm temperatures that they identify, but they do it by selecting one weather station. For example, just recently they reported that Europe, particularly France, was the warmest ever. And they based that on a single temperature reading from a thermometer that was set by the side of a concrete roadway. And so they select these temperatures. The other thing is, and I, even 3 years ago, I would have had a hard time getting people to accept this or listen to this, but they are adjusting. In fact, they have adjusted all of the global temperatures. And if people want to check out the evidence for that, they can look at a website by Tony Heller, Heller. And Tony has examined every single weather record in the world, and what they've done is they've lowered the historic temperature records, which of course makes the slope of the curve look greater than it is, which allows them then to say, oh, this is the warmest ever. And so the manipulation that's going on to maintain their political claims are just truly frightening.
We're talking with Dr. Tim Ball. He's a former professor of climatology at the University of Winnipeg. And let's talk about some of the comments we heard from the Democratic presidential hopefuls, and we'll do these in kind of an order of escalation. First of all, you've got Joe Biden and Kamala Harris being asked about things like coal and fracking. Here's Biden first.
Coal-burning plants. No one's going to build another coal-burning. We've got to shut the ones down we have, but no one is going to build a new one.
Will you commit to implementing a federal ban on fracking your first day in office, adding the United States to the list of countries who have banned this devastating practice?
There's no question I'm in favor of banning fracking.
That was Senator Harris. So, Dr. Ball, from the research you've done and that you've also been aware of, what does coal production in the modern age or fracking do to the climate?
Well, of course, all of these comments, these political comments, because these people haven't got a clue what they're talking about. I mean, they don't even know the difference between weather and climate. It's as basic as that. But it's all based upon fossil fuels, because both coal and oil and the fracking are fossil fuels. And the false creation, as I mentioned earlier in my answer, of identifying CO2 from the consumption and burning of fossil fuels, the argument that it's causing runaway global warming, and therefore we've got to eliminate CO2. And unfortunately, the whole of our Western civilization has been built around carbon, the burning of carbon and the production of carbon and coal. Biden is absolutely wrong. They are still building coal-burning plants. In fact, there was one built in North Dakota just recently by 3 energy companies, and it is one of the first in the world that burns coal absolutely clean. Now, it costs a little more for the energy that you produce doing that, but coal-burning plants are being built. In fact, places like China and India and Russia are building them as fast as they can. China, the last I saw, are building 2 every 5 weeks. And so these comments that these people make are based upon absolute ignorance and based upon what they think is politically good and the right thing to say, and therefore they just spout these things. And really, I think that they should be held accountable. Somebody should sue them and say, okay, here's what you said. Show me the facts to support what you're saying. And of course, they wouldn't be able to do it. It's criminal. Now, is politics about lying? Yeah, this is proof of it.
What about fracking? What do we know for sure on that?
Let's first explain what fracking is.
Sure.
In many parts of the world, you've got lots of oil in the ground, but it's difficult to get it out of the ground. There are very, very few places where oil comes to the surface naturally under its own pressure. In most places of the world, you've got to drill down and provide a way to the surface for that oil. But there's a lot of the oil, or all of the oil, is attached to little particles in the ground. And so to separate that oil from those particles, you need some physical force. So what fracking is that you push, initially they started it, and by the way, they started it about 60 years ago. You pump down a very mild saline solution of water, which then separates the oil from the particle, which then allows you to pump it to the surface. The most efficient fracking is achieved by pumping CO2 down into the ground. And, of course, oil companies, as I said, have been doing this for at least 50 years. It started in Texas, where they would take CO2 from their operation, pump it into the ground. And what that does is, under normal pumping, you will recover one barrel in 4 that is in the ground. But if you pump down saline water, you would recover maybe 2 barrels of the oil. But if you pump down CO2, you can recover 3 barrels of the 4. So it is, of course, then a very profitable business. The oil companies have been doing this, as I said, for 50 years at least. And of course, they kept their mouths shut when the stupid people, the politicians, said, "Oh well," they said, "Well," the oil company said, "We'll get rid of the CO2 for you. We'll pump it into the ground." And the politicians said, "Okay, we'll pay you for that." Well, they were doing that already. So the politicians stupidly were increasing the profit margin of these so-called oil companies that they hate. That's how stupid all of this is. But the fracking, as I said, is a way of recovering more of the oil than you would under just straight pumping processes.
For the last example from the town hall, we're going to go to the former Texas Congressman Beto O'Rourke, and his was less about specific policy solutions from his perspective as opposed to the urgency of the situation. And he invoked his 8-year-old son. Here's what he said.
My son, Henry, who's 8 years old, when I was talking to him the other night, he asked me, "Dad, if you win and you become president, we get to live in El Paso, right?" And I said, "No, if we win the way this works, we would live in Washington, D.C. But he knew, because I had told him about the warming that we face, that our community will be uninhabitable, will not sustain human life along this current trajectory unless something dramatically and fundamentally changes.
And that's the Democratic argument in a nutshell. How do you respond to something like that?
Well, this is pure alarmism based upon absolute ignorance. And obviously he doesn't know that the global temperature is going down, despite all of the predictions about the warming. And so, but even if it warmed, the models that they're using have reduced their prediction. They're saying now that warming would result in about 1.6 degrees Celsius warming. But even if you allow for the 2 degrees Celsius of warming, look at your city and then look to a city that's, say, 5 or 6 degrees of latitude south of you, and you'll find that it's 2 degrees warmer than yours. Is it surviving? Is it working well? Absolutely. I mean, you look at New York and compare it with somewhere further down the coast. It's 2 degrees colder in New York City than Charleston, South Carolina, for example. And all of these cities are existing very nicely, thank you. In fact, the greatest threat to the world is cooling. If you start to cool down the world, the amount of energy that you require to live in some of these northern cities would be tremendous. And in fact, if you look at a city like Minneapolis, you take away the gas pipelines and the oil pipelines that are keeping that city there, it simply couldn't survive. I mean, the average January temperature is minus 6 degrees. You couldn't live there, and so people need to start looking at the realities and what is going on. And what the results would be of the warmings that they're predicting. And, of course, the other thing is that every single model that has made predictions since 1990 about global temperature has been wrong. Every single one of them has overestimated what the global temperature will be, yet they continue to use the output of these models. If you had any other model that was as wrong as frequently as these are, and to the degree that they are, you would simply throw them out. And yet they're using these models to tell you that this warming is going to occur.
Dr. Ball, we'll have to call time there for now. As always, sir, thank you very much for your time and your expertise.
Well, thank you very kindly, and thanks for the opportunity, and let's keep some calm in the world.
Yes, sir. Dr. Tim Ball, former professor of climatology at the University of Winnipeg. I'm Greg Corombos reporting for Radio America.